Hare Krishna devotees, welcome to day 78 of our Bhakti Vaibhava seminar on Srimad Bhagavatam, third canto. And today, we're going on to the 27th chapter of the third canto, which is titled Understanding Material Nature. And it's Lord Kapila. Lord Kapila's continuing with his instructions to his mother Devahuti. Let's begin with our prayers. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharne Nirvashesha Shunyavadi Pastya Chadesha Tarne Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadha Shivas Adi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Vanchkalpatarubhyas Kripa Sindhubhya Eva Cha Paditanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Right, okay, devotees. So this 27th chapter, Understanding Material Nature, has 30 verses. 30 verses. We've divided those verses into 3 sections. First section is from verse 1 to verse 16. And we call that Kapila. Kapila describes the liberated devotee. Verse 1 to verse 16, Kapila describes the liberated devotee. Then the second section is from verse 17 to verse 20, just very short. Devahuti asks if a devotee can ever be freed from Maya. How's that? Verse 17 to verse 20, Devahuti asks if a devotee can ever be freed from Maya. And then third section, last section, from verse 21 to verse 30, Kapila explains that a devotee can become free through devotional service. Verse 21 to verse 30, Kapila explains that a devotee can become free through devotional service. Okay, so here we go. First section, verse 1 to verse 16, Kapila describes the liberated devotee. So we'll just read through the translations of the verses first. Verse 1. The personality of Godhead Kapila continued. When the living entity is thus unaffected by the modes of material nature, because he's unchanging and does not claim proprietorship, he remains apart from the reactions of the modes, although abiding in a material body, just as the sun remains aloof from its reflection on water. That's interesting. Verse 2, when the soul is under the spell of material nature and false ego, identifying his body as the self, he becomes absorbed in material activities, and by the influence of false ego, he thinks that he is the proprietor of everything. Verse 3, the conditioned soul therefore transmigrates into different species of life, higher and lower, because of his association with the modes of material nature. Unless he is relieved of material activities, he has to accept this position because of his faulty work. 4. Actually, a living entity is transcendental to material existence, but because of his mentality of lording it over material nature, his material existential condition does not cease. And just as in a dream, he is affected by all sorts of disadvantages. Verse 5, it is the duty of every conditioned soul to engage his polluted consciousness, which is now attached to material enjoyment, in very serious devotional service with detachment. Thus his mind and consciousness will be under full control. Verse 6, one has to become faithful by practicing the controlling process of the yoga system, and must elevate himself to the platform of unalloyed devotional service by chanting and hearing about me, about Lord Kapila, about the Supreme Lord. 7, in executing devotional service, one has to see every living entity equally, without enmity towards anyone, yet without intimate connections with anyone. One has to observe celibacy, be grave, and execute his eternal activities, offering the results to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. 8, for his income, a devotee should be satisfied with what he earns without great difficulty. He should not eat more than what is necessary. He should live in a secluded place and always be thoughtful, peaceful, friendly, compassionate, and self-realized. 9, one's seeing power should be increased through knowledge of spirit and matter, and one should not unnecessarily identify himself with the body and thus become attracted by bodily relationships. 10, one should be situated in the transcendental position beyond the stages of material consciousness and should be aloof from all other conceptions of life. Thus, realizing freedom from false ego, one should see his own self just as he sees the sun in the sky. Verse 11, a liberated soul realizes the absolute personality of Godhead, who is transcendental and who is manifest as a reflection, even in the false ego. He is the support of the material cause, and he enters into everything. He is absolute, one without a second, and he is the eyes of the illusory energy. Verse 12, the presence of the Supreme Lord can be realized just as the sun is realized first as a reflection on water, and again as a second reflection on the wall of a room, although the sun itself is situated in the sky. 13, the self-realized soul is thus reflected first in the threefold ego, and then in the body, senses, and mind. 14. Although a devotee appears to be merged in the 5 material elements, the objects of material enjoyment, the material senses, and material mind and intelligence, he is understood to be awake and to be freed from the false ego. Verse 15. The living entity can vividly feel his existence as the seer, but because of the disappearance of the ego during the state of deep sleep, he falsely thinks himself to be lost, like a man who has lost his fortune and feels distressed, thinking himself to be lost. And verse 16, when, by mature understanding, one can realize his individuality, then the situation he accepts under false ego becomes manifest to him. All right, so let's get into it here. So the first section is Kapila describes the liberated devotee. It's verse 1 to verse 16. Let's get into verse 1 in detail. The personality of Godhead, Kapila continued. When the living entity is thus unaffected by the modes of material nature, because he is unchanging and does not claim proprietorship, he remains apart from the reactions of the modes, although abiding in a material body, just as the sun remains aloof from its reflection on water. Right, okay, so there's a purport here. Prabhupada notes in the previous chapter, at the end of the previous chapter, Lord Kapila concluded that simply by beginning devotional service, one can attain detachment and transcendental knowledge for understanding the science of God. So the same point is made here. Same principle. A person who's detached from the modes is like the sun reflected on water. Movement, if the water moves, doesn't affect the sun. It affects the reflection, of course, but the reflection is not the sun. The sun is way away. So when one engages fully in devotional service, he becomes like the sun reflected on water. He appears to be in this world, but actually he's in the transcendental world. So Prabhupada notes that as the reflection of the sun appears to be on the water, but is actually many millions of miles away, so one engaged in devotional service is nirguna, or unaffected by the qualities of material nature. Guna means the modes, and nirguna means free from the modes. Right, so the second paragraph, the term avikar appears in the second to last line, and in the word for word, it's translated as from being without change. And Prabhupada says, avikar means without change. So Bhagavad Gita confirms, every living entity is part and parcel of the Lord. So his eternal position is to cooperate or dovetail his energy with the Supreme Lord. That's his unchanging position. Yes, that's eternal. So, as soon as he uses his energy and activities for sense gratification, then there's a change of position called vikara. Similarly, even when in the body, when he does devotional service under the spiritual master, he comes to the position that is without change. Yes. So Bhagavatam, Prabhupada says, sort of in the middle of the paragraph, that as stated in the Bhagavatam, liberation means reinstatement in one's original position. Muktir hitvanyata rupam swarupena vyavastati. Muktir hitvanyata rupam. The real form of mukti, liberation, is muktir hitvanyata rupam swarupena. When you get situated in your swarup, your eternal original position. So anyway, that position is one of devotional service. And when one becomes detached from Maya, and simultaneously engages fully in devotional service, that's changelessness. So Prabhupada refers to the term akartritvat, means not doing anything for sense gratification. Because when you do something for yourself at one's own risk, Prabhupada says, then there's a sense of proprietorship, and therefore there's a reaction. But when we do everything for Krishna, there's no proprietorship. It's all he's the proprietor, Krishna. So by changelessness and by not claiming proprietorship, one immediately is transcendental, not touched by the modes. Just as the reflection of the sun is unaffected by the water. Verse 2, when the soul is under the spell of material nature and false ego, identifying his body as the self, he becomes absorbed in material activities, and by the influence of false ego, he thinks that he's the proprietor of everything. So the conditioned souls, they're forced to act under the modes. They have no real independence. But when they're under the direction of the Lord, then they're free. But when under the impression that they're there for sense gratification, then they're under the spell of the modes. Prabhupada refers to Bhagavad Gita. It's the 3rd chapter, I forget the verse number. Prakrite kriyamanani, that one acts according to the particular modes you've acquired, but falsely you think you're the proprietor. So this false sense of proprietorship can be avoided by doing devotional service under the Lord and or the spiritual master. Just like Arjuna, he was feeling responsible for killing people, so he didn't want to do it. But he became free of this when he was under Krishna's direction. Krishna took all the reactions. So Arjuna fought, but he was free from the reactions of fighting. Yeah. Although when he didn't want to fight on his own account, then he was responsible. So that is the difference between liberation and conditioning. Even a conditioned soul may be very good and act in the mode of goodness, but he's still conditioned under the material nature. So the devotee acts under the Lord. So even though his actions may not be very good, not like high quality, very advanced to the common man, but the devotee is not held responsible. Verse 3, the conditioned soul therefore transmigrates into different species of life, higher and lower, because of his association with the modes of material nature. Unless he's relieved of material activities, he has to accept this position because of his faulty work. So Prabhupada refers to the term karma doshai, which means faulty action, faulty work. Yeah, dosha means faulty. And Prabhupada explains it refers to any activity, good or bad, done in the material world. They're all contaminated. They're all faulty actions because they're associated with matter. Yeah, so of course, generally religious people think that bad things, we must not do them. They're sinful. But even the fact is, good material things entangle you on the material level. So you have to stop both and simply do devotional service. So Prabhupada explains this by saying that a foolish conditioned soul may think he's doing good by building a hospital or a school, but he doesn't know it's all faulty because it's under the modes, and it will entangle him, and he'll just get caught up in material life. So even doing things like that, making a hospital, won't help you get free from transmigration. Maybe you'll take birth as a demigod or whatever, high family, whatever it may be. But it's all faulty because it doesn't give liberation. And so if you have a birth in a nice place or nice family, doesn't mean you're going to avoid death, material tribulation, sickness. So the conditioned souls, they don't understand that any act for sense gratification is faulty. And only devotional service will give relief from reactions. Only devotional service. So if one doesn't stop faulty actions, one will have to continue in what is called here samsara padavim, which just means the material world, or the process of birth and death, basically, from which there's no release unless you take to Krishna consciousness. Then you go back to Godhead. So therefore, one who wants liberation has to turn his activities to devotional service. There's no alternative. Verse 4. Actually, a living entity is transcendental to material existence, but because of his mentality of lording it over material nature, his material existential condition does not cease. And just as in a dream, he's affected by all sorts of disadvantages. Yes, so, okay. So Srila Prabhupada makes the point that the example of the dream is very appropriate. Due to different mental conditions, in dreams we're put into good and bad situations, advantageous, disadvantageous. So similarly, the soul has nothing to do with material nature, but due to the mentality of lording it over, he's placed in conditional existence. So dreams are essentially hallucinations of different sorts based on different mental conditions. So it's like material life is like that dreaming state, hallucinating state, but you think it's very real. In the second paragraph, Prabhupada says that conditional existence is described here as dhyayato vishayan asya. Vishaya means an object of enjoyment, sense gratification. So as long as you continue to think you can enjoy material advantages, you're in conditional life. But as soon as we come to our senses and understand that we're not the enjoyers, but the Lord is, then it's nectar. Right, so Bhagavad Gita, famous verse 529, the peace formula, we need to understand that Bhoktaram Yagyatapasam, Krishna is the beneficiary of all sacrifices, penances, just of everything you do. And Krishna is the proprietor of all the three worlds, Sarva Loka Maheshwaram. And he's Suridam Sarva Bhutanam. Prabhupada doesn't mention the Sanskrit, but it means he's the actual friend of all living entities. But instead of letting the position of being the proprietor, the enjoyer, and the friend of all living beings, instead of leaving that for the Supreme Lord, we claim, we say, no, I'm proprietor, I'm enjoyer, I'm the friend. So we perform philanthropic work, thinking we're the friends of human society. Yeah. So like this, but we cannot help many people, it's a fact. But Krishna can help everyone. So we should leave it up to him. And what we should do, we should try to help the conditioned souls understand these points, that Krishna is the proprietor, the enjoyer, and the friend. And if we accept him as the friend, we'll never be cheated. Otherwise your friends in material life, they may or they will just cheat you sooner or later. Yeah. Right, and Krishna will give us all help if we accept him as friend and really try to please him. So arousing this consciousness in people is actually the greatest type of greatest service one can do to the conditioned souls. Rather than posing oneself as a great friend of every living entity. So Srila Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, then this illusory dream of lording it over material nature will vanish. Verse 5, it's the duty of every conditioned soul to engage his polluted consciousness, which is now attached to material enjoyment, but to engage his polluted consciousness in very serious devotional service with detachment. Thus his mind and consciousness will be under full control. So, Prabhupada makes the point that the process of liberation is described very nicely here. Yes. What is it? What is that nice description? That we need to engage our whatever condition we're in, even if we're in polluted consciousness, we need to engage ourselves in very serious devotional service with detachment. And in this way, the mind and one's consciousness will be under full control. So again, Prabhupada makes the point, same point as the previous purport. The cause of conditioned life is thinking that we're the enjoyers, the proprietors, and the friends. And this mentality arises from contemplating sense gratification. So, thinking you're the enjoyer, proprietor, and friend is, it's sense gratification. That's all it is. You're just concentrating on sense gratification. Like the leader of a country, the leader of the country, or some humanitarian. They may say they're serving everyone, but they're just serving themselves. They're just serving themselves. Here in South Africa, it is so chronic. But unfortunately, the conditioned souls can't understand this because they're bewildered by the spell of material nature. So what to do? What to do? Well, this verse recommends engage very seriously in devotional service to the Lord. So that means, that naturally includes not thinking you're the proprietor, benefactor, or friend or enjoyer. So we should always be cognizant that Krishna is the real enjoyer, the Supreme Lord. That's the basic principle of devotional service, bhakti yoga. And we must be convinced of these three principles from Bhagavad Gita 5:29, from the previous purport and this one too. We must be convinced that Krishna is the proprietor, Krishna is the enjoyer, Krishna is the friend. And we should be convinced about this, but we should try to convince others too. Right, so second paragraph, Prabhupada says, as soon as we engage in such serious devotional service, really serious devotional service, the propensity to claim lordship over material nature, it just disappears. That detachment is called vairagya. Instead of being absorbed in so-called material lordship, one engages in Krishna consciousness. And this is control of the consciousness. So, we referred to one verse, I forget the number, but it's in the second chapter of the first canto, which says, Vasudeve Bhagavati Bhakti Yoga Prayojita Janiyat Yasu Vairagyam Jnanam Chayada Hoitukam. That when you engage in devotional service to Vasudeva, Krishna, then causelessly knowledge and detachment just appear within the heart, just like that. Yes. So that's what's being said here. Engage seriously in devotional service. Then the propensity to claim lordship over material nature disappears. Right. So yoga necessitates control of the senses. Of course, the senses are always active. Sure, they're on the go. So what to do with them? You can't really stop them, but engage them in devotional service. If you try to stop them, you'll fail. Prabhupada mentions Vishvamitra, who was living very austere life, trying to control his senses, just doing nothing. But then Menaka came. And all that happened was, initially at least, he heard her ankle bells, and then he fell down just from that. But actually there are many examples of that sort of thing happening. So anyway, unless your mind and consciousness is fully engaged, seriously engaged in devotional service, there's a chance for the mind to become occupied with desires for sense gratification. Right, so then, third paragraph, a very significant point is made here, Prabhupada says, from the verse, Prasaktam asatam pati. The mind is always attracted by asat, the temporary, material existence. And because we've been associated with Maya since time immemorial, we're habituated to being attached to material nature. But actually the mind has to be fixed at the eternal lotus feet of the Lord. And Prabhupada quotes a line from the famous verse about Maharaj Ambarish, Savaimana Krishna Padara Vindayo. He was always engaged. His mind, mana, Krishna Padara Vindayo. His mind was always fixed at the lotus feet of Krishna. So we need to do that, then everything will be nice. And thus the seriousness of Bhakti Yoga is stressed in this verse. So verse 6. One has to become faithful by practicing the controlling process of the yoga system and must elevate oneself to the platform of unalloyed devotional service by chanting and hearing about me. So, it's an interesting point we can note is that this is Lord Kapila. He is teaching Sankhya to Devahuti, but actually he's teaching devotional service. Real Sankhya means being fully engaged in devotional service. So anyway, there's a fairly major purport here. Prabhupada makes the point that yoga means actually Ashtanga yoga is in 8 different senses. Yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. So Prabhupada gives some explanation of some of these at least. Yama and niyama means following strict regulations, practicing the controlling your senses by following strict regulations. And asana refers to the physical sitting postures and just physical postures. So these help to raise one to the standard of faithfulness in devotional service. This sort of practice of yoga, physical exercise, it's not the ultimate goal. The real end is to concentrate the mind, control the mind, and train oneself to be situated in devotional service. Right, okay, so now the second paragraph, bhavena or bhava. This is in the 3rd line of the Sanskrit, and it's translated as, in the word for word, with devotion. So Prabhupada says bhavena or bhava is a very important factor in the practice of yoga or in any spiritual process. Devotion, bhakti. So it's explained in Bhagavad Gita 10.8, Buddha Bhava Samanvita, that we should all be absorbed in thought of love for Krishna. And when you know that Krishna is the source of everything emanates from him, then you've understood what the Vedanta says, or the first verse of the Bhagavatam too, for that matter, Janmad Yasya Yataha, the original source of everything. That's Krishna. And when you understand that, when it's clear, then you can become absorbed in bhava, which is the beginning of love for Krishna. Right, so we go on to the next paragraph, 3rd paragraph, fairly substantial. So Srila Rupa Goswami explains in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu how this bhava is achieved. First, you must have faith. And faith, how's faith attained? By controlling the senses, either by yoga practice, following the rules and regulations, sitting postures, or by directly engaging in bhakti yoga, as the previous verse recommended, serious devotional service. So really we prefer the latter, engaging in bhakti yoga. So then Prabhupada says that if we're going to do that, bhakti yoga, then of the 9 processes, first and foremost is to chant and hear about the Lord. Yes. That's also mentioned in this verse, mat kata shravanena cha. Hearing my talk about me with faith. So, Prabhupada says that you can come to faithfulness by following the rules or by chanting and hearing. I mean, basically, Prabhupada already said that, but there he says it again, but particularly by chanting and hearing. about the Lord's activities. Yeah, so Bhakti Yoga is direct, and the other process of, the 8 yoga processes, sitting exercises, what else? And so on. They're indirect. But even if you decide to take the indirect process, then you won't be successful unless eventually you come fully to the direct process of hearing and chanting. Yeah. So one should do these things nishkapatena, without duplicity. Prabhupada points out that the impersonalists they're full of duplicity. Sometimes they pretend to do devotional service, but actually their idea is to become one with the Lord, not to be his servant. This is very duplicitous. It really is. Kapata means duplicity. Nishkapatena means without difficulty. So Bhagavatam rejects this duplicity. Right in the second verse, Dharma Projatikaitavocha Paramo Nimatsaranam Satam, that this Bhagavatam is for those who are completely free from envy and just not interested in doing devotional service or doing any religious activity for material benefit. So this is being stressed. Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, unless one is completely faithful to the Supreme Personality of Godhead and engages himself in the process of hearing and chanting the glories of the Lord, there's no possibility for liberation. Verse 7. In executing devotional service, one has to see every living entity equally, without enmity towards anyone, yet without intimate connections with anyone. One has to observe celibacy, be grave, and execute his eternal activities, offering the results to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That's nice, isn't it? That's really nice. So, Prabhupada in the purport points out that devotees who are seriously engaged in devotional service, they're equal to all living entities. There are various species, of course they're different, but a devotee doesn't see the outward dress of the body. He sees the inner, the soul inhabiting the body. So because each and every soul is part and parcel of Krishna, he doesn't see any difference. That is the vision of the learned devotee. And as Bhagavad Gita chapter 5 verse 18 says, such a devotee, learned sage, doesn't see any difference between the Brahmin, the cow, the dog, or the elephant. They're all spirit souls, part and parcel of the Lord. So therefore he has no enmity. Doesn't mean he associates with all of them, because he wants to progress in devotional service, so he associates with the devotees, but still he sees all the living entities equally. So then, second paragraph, a devotee is a person who observes the vow of celibacy. But Prabhupada explains, celibacy doesn't necessarily mean to be absolutely free from sex life. For grihastas to engage in sex life with their wife is permitted, and it's also considered celibacy. However, having said that, Prabhupada makes the point, best policy is to avoid sex life altogether. Yeah. But still, devotee can marry and live peacefully with a wife and have children, and that's acceptable in Krishna consciousness. So then, third paragraph, Prabhupada says that the devotee shouldn't speak needlessly. A serious devotee has no time for nonsense, always busy in Krishna consciousness, and whenever the devotee speaks, it's only about Krishna. So mona, silence, doesn't mean that we shouldn't speak anything at all. Doesn't mean that. But what it does mean is no talking nonsense. Rather, being enthusiastic to speak about Krishna. So then there's another term which is important here, swadharmena, being exclusively engaged in one's eternal occupation, which is to be the eternal servant of the Lord in Krishna consciousness. So then the next word, baliyasa, means offering the results of all activities to the Lord. So the devotee doesn't act for sense gratification, personal sense gratification. Whatever he earns or eats or whatever he does, he offers to the Lord. So then, verse 8. For his income, a devotee should be satisfied with what he earns without great difficulty. He should not eat more than what is necessary. He should live in a secluded place and always be thoughtful, peaceful, friendly, compassionate, and self-realized. So there's a substantial purport here, actually. Anyway, let's get into it. So first point in the purport, if you got a material body, you got to maintain it by doing some work. But a devotee should only work as is absolutely necessary, and the rest of his time and energy should be engaged in devotional service. And the devotee should be satisfied with just enough, no extravagance. Shouldn't endeavor to earn more or accumulate the unnecessary. So conditioned souls, of course, if they don't have any money, or even if they do have money, they're always working hard to earn with the object of lording it over material nature. So Kapila Dev is instructing us, we shouldn't endeavor hard for things which come automatically. The word, Prabhupada says, used in this connection is yadrichaya, which means it's the first word in the first line of the verse. Yadrichaya means every living entity has a predestined happiness and distress in his present body. This is the law of karma. So even if you do work hard, extra hard, you'll only get things which you're due to get. Yes, right. But it all comes according to our karma. Sometimes we face danger or misery unexpectedly, and sometimes some prosperity just comes upon us without us making any effort. That's because so we should let these things come as is predestined. And otherwise, we should engage in Krishna consciousness and in devotional service and just be satisfied with what comes. So, because if it's predestined that you won't be prosperous compared to another person, don't worry about it. If you're a devotee, Krishna will look after you. So just try to advance in Krishna consciousness. Don't depend on material situations. Because Krishna consciousness is free from conditions imposed by material life. And a poor person can execute Krishna consciousness as effectively as a rich person. So therefore Prabhupada concludes the first paragraph. One should therefore be very satisfied with his position as offered by the Lord. So, okay, there's another word here which is important, metabok. One should eat only as much as necessary to maintain body and soul together. Don't be gluttonous. Eat vegetarian foods, grains, fruits, milk, etc. Particularly don't get into meat eating and that sort of thing, but only take prasad, foods in goodness which have been offered to the Lord, not things in passion and ignorance, and don't be greedy. Be thoughtful, be a muni. Always think of Krishna and how to serve him. That should be your only anxiety, your only concern. How can I serve Krishna? How can I serve him better? So as a materialist is always thinking of improving his material condition, a devotee should always think, how can I improve my Krishna consciousness? This is a muni. So then on to the third paragraph. Next item is maitra. Next thing is, that's the fourth paragraph. Third paragraph is, devotees should live in a secluded place. Yeah. So, generally people are interested in money, material advancement. This is all unnecessary for a devotee. So a devotee should select a place of residence where everyone is interested in devotional service. Yeah. So a devotee might go to a sacred place of pilgrimage where other devotees live. But not to live where there's a lot of ordinary people. No, not like that. But rather in a nice peaceful place with devotees. Of course you can go out and give Krishna consciousness to a large number of ordinary people. But for your actual living, then it should be a little secluded. Like this, where I am right now. It's really nice. So then the next thing is shanta, or peacefulness. Devotee shouldn't be agitated. Devotee should, as we just read actually, we should be satisfied with the natural income which comes without great effort, eating only as much as we need to keep our health, living in a secluded place, and being peaceful, being accepting of our circumstances by Krishna's mercy. So then the next thing, the fourth paragraph, is maitra, friendliness. Devotees should be friendly to everyone, very nice, very kind, giving mercy to everyone, all the materialists, but intimate friendship only with devotees. And Prabhupada says, with materialistic people, a devotee might say, yes, sir, what you say is all right, but he doesn't get involved with them. But of course, well, as we mentioned, he should be compassionate for the innocent, who are a little open-minded and maybe a little interested in Krishna consciousness, but not people who are atheists, not people like that. And Prabhupada actually says, neither atheists nor those very advanced in spiritual realization. Now, what does that mean? That means people who, like impersonalists. Yeah. So then the devotee should be Atmavan, situated in a spiritual position. And whatever goes on in your life, don't forget your main concern, which is to advance spiritually. Don't identify with the body or mind. Atma can mean body and mind, but here Atma or Atmavan means to be self-possessed. So like this, the devotee should always remain in pure consciousness that I'm a soul, I'm not this body or mind. And Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying that will make him progress confidently in Krishna consciousness. So there you are, devotees. We'll carry on from here tomorrow. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.